At 3:12 in the morning, every furnace on Quarry Lane died. Every smart thermostat went dark. Every backup plan failed. And in one freezing house after another, families began watching their breath hang in the bedroom air. But at the very end of the street, the man they had called Dirt Elias struck one match, and fed 3 sticks into a clay monster in his living room. By sunrise, that ugly wall of mud and copper would be the only warm place left in Briar Creek. Elias Mercer had never cared about looking respectable. That was the first thing his neighbors disliked about him. He was 64, a retired boiler mechanic from the old paper mill. With a gray beard, he cut himself in hands that looked permanently stained by iron dust. His house sat at the bottom of Quarry Lane, where the paved road curled into a tidy little loop of split. Level homes, cedar fences, trimmed boxwoods, and porch lights controlled by phone apps. Everyone else on Quarry Lane owned matching mailboxes. Elias had welded his from a dented piece of stovepipe. Everyone else raked their leaves into paper bags. Elias piled his behind the garage and called it future soil. Everyone else hired people. Elias repaired things with salvaged bolts, bent copper, and the kind of patience that made successful people uncomfortable. His nearest critic was Preston Vale, who lived 3 houses up in a renovated white colonial with black shutters and a heated stone walkway. Preston sold commercial insurance and chaired the Briar Creek Lakeview Association, which was just important enough for him to pronounce it like a public office. Preston liked order. He liked clean siding. He liked resale value. What he did not like was the dump truck that arrived in front of Elias Mercer's house on a damp September morning and tipped a mountain of tan clay river sand and chopped straw onto the driveway. By noon, half the neighborhood was watching from behind curtains. By evening, the group chat had a name for the project: the indoor swamp. Elias did not explain himself to the group chat. He just went outside before breakfast every day, shoveled the clay into a wheelbarrow, and pushed it straight through his front door. For 26 days, he worked like a man racing a clock no one else could see. He tore the carpet out of his living room. He stacked firebrick into a narrow burn chamber. He ran black steel pipe through a long, low bench frame that wrapped along 2 walls. Then he packed the whole thing in cob, clay, sand, straw, and water, until his living room looked as if a riverbank had crawled inside and taken a seat. That was only the part people could understand enough to mock. Behind the bench, Elias threaded loops of reclaimed copper into the earthen mass. In the utility closet, he mounted a small 12-volt pump, no bigger than a lunchbox. On the roof, he bolted one battered solar panel where the afternoon sun still reached over the maples, and out back, behind a fence nobody liked, he built a steaming mound of wood chips around a coil of hose, a compost heat pile. To Preston Vale, it looked like madness with plumbing. To Elias, it was a heat bank. That was what he called it when Nia Brooks finally asked him. Nia lived across the bend with her 6-month-old son, Milo, and worked nights as an ambulance dispatcher. She was the only neighbor who spoke to Elias without sounding as if she were collecting evidence. One afternoon she found him in the driveway, rinsing clay off his forearms with a garden hose. "Mr. Mercer," she said, nodding toward the living room window. "Are you building a fireplace or a bunker?" Elias smiled, but only a little. "Neither," he said. A bank, for heat." He turned off the hose and pointed to the house. "Most folks spend heat the second they make it. Furnace burns, blower pushes, room warms up, heat leaks out, then the furnace starts begging for fuel again. This thing does the opposite. It burns a small fire hot, steals the heat from the exhaust, stores it in all that earth, and gives it back slowly." Nia looked at the clay, streaked bench through the window. "How slowly?" if I charge it right. Elias wiped his hands on a rag. 2 days of useful warmth, maybe more if the wind behaves. She glanced toward the roof. And the copper? That keeps the edges of the house from freezing. The little pump moves fluid through the warm mass. Then out through that compost mound, decay makes heat. Not much, but steady. Steady matters when the grid quits pretending it is invincible. Naya gave a tired laugh. You think it's going to quit? Elias looked past her toward the black wires hanging over Quarry Lane. They built this whole county like electricity is a law of nature, he said quietly. It isn't. It's a delivery service. And delivery services stop. Naya remembered that line. Everyone else remembered different ones. Preston remembered the clay on the driveway. His wife, Laurel, remembered the straw blowing against their fence. Owen Park, a remote software engineer 2 doors down, remembered the sound of Elias cutting pipe in the evening, and posted that the old man was building a medieval hot tub. The Lakeview Association sent a formal notice: unauthorized exterior storage, unapproved roof, mounted equipment, potential hazard, possible nuisance structure. Elias read the letter once, folded it twice, and used it to light a test fire. By Halloween, children had started daring one another to run up and slap the side of the mud house. By Thanksgiving, Preston had convinced 2 board members that Elias should be fined daily until he removed the system. By early December, Elias had stopped attending association meetings and started stacking dry scrap wood under a tarp beside his shed, not logs. That bothered Preston too. The wood was too ugly to be impressive. Pallet offcuts, storm branches, pieces of old apple crate, bundles of thumb, thick sticks. Fuel, Elias called it. Trash, Preston called it. Then the forecasts began changing. It started as a normal January cold snap. Then the models darkened. A slab of polar air was dropping south and stalling over northern New England. Meteorologists on the local station kept using phrases that made them look uncomfortable. Rapid pressure fall. Flash freeze. Ice loading. Life. Threatening wind chill. The storm picked up a name online before the news gave it one. The Black Cap Cold Wave. At the grocery store, people bought milk, candles, and frozen pizza, which said almost everything about how seriously they understood the situation. Preston filled the tank for his whole house propane generator and told Laurel they were better prepared than anyone on the street. Owen bought batteries, a bottle of bourbon, and a new heated throw blanket that needed electricity to work. Naya bought formula, canned soup, and 3 extra fleece sleepers for Milo because she could not get Elias's sentence out of her head. Electricity is a delivery service, and delivery services stop. On Tuesday afternoon, the rain began. Not snow at first. Rain. It clicked against windows, coated tree limbs, and turned every driveway on Quarry Lane into gray glass. By 4 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By 6, the rain became sleet. By 8, the sleet became a hard white powder that blew sideways under porch roofs and into keyholes. Elias stood in his living room in wool socks and suspenders, checking the draft on the heater. The clay bench was already warm. Not hot. Warm. The way a sunlit rock stays warm after dusk. He fed the fire with a handful of dry sticks and listened to the rocket chamber catch. The flame did not crawl upward like a normal fireplace. It pulled sideways with a low, hungry roar, vanished into the insulated throat, and sent clean heat into the steel barrel before the exhaust disappeared through the bench. The bench drank it. That was the only way Elias ever described it. It drank heat. At 10:30 p.m. Quarry Lane still had power, but the wind had become violent. Trees snapped and cracked in the woods behind the subdivision. The streetlights flickered hard enough to make everyone look up. At 1:47 a.m. a limb the size of a telephone pole came down half a mile away. At 3:12 a.m. the substation on County Road 9 flashed blue behind the clouds. Quarry Lane went black. Not dim. Black. The kind of black that turns a familiar hallway into a stranger. Preston Vale woke to the silence before he understood it. No furnace blower. No refrigerator hum. No security system chirp. No blue numbers on the alarm clock. "Laurel," he said, already reaching for his phone. "Power's out," she groaned. "Generator? Any second." They waited. 10 seconds. 20. A minute. Nothing. Preston sat up, irritated more than afraid. He had paid for automatic transfer. He had paid for winterization. He had paid for the sort of equipment that was supposed to make bad weather a problem for other people. He put on boots, a parka, over his pajamas, and forced open the side door. The cold hit him so hard his lungs locked. Outside, the world had become white noise and knives. Snow drove across the yard in sheets. Ice crusted the generator casing. Preston stumbled to the unit, ripped at the panel with numb fingers, and saw nothing. No display, no fault code, no reassuring green light. The propane regulator line had iced over, starved the engine, and left his expensive backup system sitting beside the house like a dead appliance. He kicked it once. The pain shot through his foot. By 4:30, the temperature outside had fallen to 20, 7 below zero. Inside Preston's house, the walls began surrendering. At first, the cold felt like a draft near the stairs, a chill around the windows. Laurel wrapped herself in a duvet, and kept saying the power company would have it back soon. By dawn, the living room was 38 degrees. By 8, their kitchen faucet gave one soft metallic pop inside the wall. Down the street, Owen's apartment over the garage was worse. His bottled water had a skin of ice on top. His phone had 11% battery. He sat under 3 blankets and watched his breath drift across his laptop screen, as if the machine could still save him. At Nia's house, fear arrived before daylight. Milo would not settle. She had wrapped him in 2 sleepers, a fleece sack, and her own coat, but his little face was too pale. The apartment thermostat was dead. The baseboard heat was dead. The room felt less like a room, and more like the inside of a cooler. Nia pressed him against her chest and whispered nonsense words while the wind worried at the windows. Then she looked toward the end of Quarry Lane, toward the mud house inside Elias Mercer's living room. It was 75 degrees, not because of a miracle, because the heat bank had already been charged. The earthen bench radiated warmth from floor level to shoulder height. The steel barrel made a soft clicking sound as it expanded and settled. A kettle steamed on top of it. The small pump hummed in the closet, moving warm fluid through the copper loop, just fast enough to keep the cold from biting into the corners. The windows were clear. No frost lace. No frozen corners. No breath clouds. Elias sat in a wooden chair beside the bench, listening to emergency radio static and drinking coffee from a chipped green mug. The county dispatcher sounded exhausted. Multiple feeder lines down. Road crews immobilized. Main substation fire. Estimated restoration, unknown. Residents should shelter in place. Do not attempt travel. Frostbite may occur in minutes. Elias lowered the radio and stared at the front door. He knew someone would come. He just did not know who would be desperate enough to come first. At 8:22 a.m. the knock landed. Not a polite knock, a pounding, gloved, panicked hammering. Elias opened the door, and the storm shoved Nia Brooks halfway into his entryway. She had Milo bundled against her chest under a coat, and her lips were so blue they looked bruised. "Please," she said. "He's cold. He won't cry, right?" Elias moved before she finished. "Bench," he said. "Now." Naya stumbled into the living room and stopped. The heat hit her like a wall. She made one broken sound, somewhere between a sob and disbelief, then laid Milo on a folded blanket across the clay bench. The earthen surface was warm enough to feel alive, steady enough not to burn. Elias covered the baby lightly and checked his breathing. "Stay right here," he said. "No rushing him. Let the heat come to him." Naya sank beside the bench, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. 2 minutes later, another shape appeared through the blowing snow. Preston Vale. He reached Elias's porch bent forward against the wind. His expensive parka crusted white, his face raw with cold and humiliation. For a second, neither man spoke. Elias stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame. Preston looked past him into the impossible warmth. He saw Nia crying beside the bench. He saw Milo's cheeks beginning to pinken. He saw the steel barrel humming with heat. He saw the mud structure he had tried to outlaw doing what his generator, his money, and his confidence could not. "Elias," Preston said, and the word cracked in his throat. "Laurel can't feel her feet." Elias did not smile. He did not lecture. He stepped back. "Then stop letting the cold win," he said. "Bring her." By mid-morning, the mud house had become the only plan Quarry Lane had. Preston returned with Laurel wrapped in a comforter and half carried her across the street. Owen arrived next, dragging a plastic storage bin full of canned food, headlamps, a camp stove, and a battery pack. An elderly couple from the corner, the Danvers, came in holding hands and apologizing before they were fully through the door. Elias stopped counting apologies. He counted bodies instead. 9 people, 1 infant, 1 dog, 1 earthen bench, 1 small fire that did not look big enough to matter. That was what unsettled everyone most. They had expected survival to look dramatic. Flames roaring in a giant fireplace. A generator screaming in the yard. Fuel cans, machinery, noise. Instead, survival looked like 3 fistfuls of scrap wood disappearing into a brick throat, while a clay bench quietly gave back yesterday's heat. Owen crouched near the burn chamber, fascinated despite his chattering teeth. "That's it?" he asked. "That little fire is heating the whole room?" "No," Elias said, handing him a mug of soup warmed on the barrel. "That little fire is charging the mass. The mass is heating the room." Owen looked around at the bench where people were pressed shoulder to shoulder. "So it's a battery." Elias nodded. "Just not the kind you can order with free shipping." For the next 36 hours Quarry Lane lived inside Elias Mercer's heat bank. Outside, the storm erased the subdivision one drift at a time. Cars became white humps. Mailboxes disappeared. Snow sealed front doors from the outside. The road was somewhere beneath it all, but no one could prove it. Inside, people learned the rules of warmth. Keep the door closed. Open it only in pairs. Heat soup on the barrel, not over the feed tube. Do not smother the draft. Do not waste dry socks. Do not pretend pride is insulation. That last one became unspoken law. Laurel, who had once called the project unsanitary, organized blankets across the bench by who needed the most heat. Owen kept the small devices charged from Elias's battery bank and radioed updates to a volunteer frequency. Naya slept in short, guilty bursts with Milo against her, waking every few minutes to touch his cheek and make sure it was warm. Preston could not sit still. He shoveled snow from the inner side of the front door. He melted snow for washing water. He apologized to the Danvers for blocking their request to install solar panels the year before. Then he apologized to Elias again. Elias accepted none of it dramatically. He just kept saying, "Feed the stove." So Preston learned. He learned how to listen for the rocket chamber's low draw. He learned that too much wood made smoke, and small dry pieces made heat. He learned that the clay bench warmed slowly and gave slowly. He learned that a house was not protected by what it cost. It was protected by what it could keep doing after the easy system stopped. On Thursday afternoon, the radio confirmed the bad news. County Road 9 was still blocked. 2 transmission structures were down. Crews could not reach the substation until the wind dropped. Restoration could take 3 more days. No one spoke for a long moment. 3 more days changed the room. It turned inconvenience into ordeal. It turned gratitude into dependence. It turned Elias's strange project from impressive to necessary. That evening, as the sky outside went purple behind sheets of windblown ice, Preston stood beside the bench and looked at the living room he had once described as an eyesore. "This should be illegal," he said quietly. Elias glanced up. Preston swallowed. Not the heater, the fact that none of us had anything but wires. Elias fed 2 sticks into the fire. "Most people don't prepare for losing the thing they have never seen fail," he said. "That's not stupidity, it's training." The room stayed quiet after that, because every person there knew he was right. The real crisis came Friday before dawn. Elias woke from a chair with his eyes open and his body already tense. Something was missing. Not a crash, not a shout, a sound. The little pump in the utility closet had stopped humming. He stood, crossed the room, and put his hand against the copper line near the floor. Cooler than it should have been. Then he checked the battery meter, 10.6 volts too low. The room was still warm, but the perimeter of the house was beginning to lose its shield. The compost loop had stopped moving. If the fluid sat too long in the exposed run outside, even the antifreeze mixture could thicken. If it froze hard enough, the line could split. If the line split, the heat bank would not die instantly, but its safety margin would. Preston saw Elias's face and stood. "What happened?" "Panels buried," Elias said. "Batteries drained. Pump stopped. So we run on the bench. For a while?" "How long is a while?" Elias looked toward the dark windows. "Depends how fast the outside starts stealing." That woke the room. Owen sat up. Naya pulled Milo closer. Laurel whispered Preston's name. Elias pulled on insulated bibs. "I need the roof cleared, and I need the bypass box at the compost pile opened. There's a manual relief crank inside. If the line slushes and pressure builds, it has to be opened before the seals go." Owen was already reaching for his boots. "I can climb." "No," Elias said. "You're 64. And you're shaking." "I'm also lighter than Preston." Preston looked at him. Owen looked back. "Sorry." The wind screamed outside the wall, like it had heard its name. Preston reached for the spare parka hanging by the door. "I'll do the compost box." Laurel grabbed his sleeve. "Preston." He did not pull away. He just looked at her, and something in his face had changed. Not heroism, not drama. Accounting. The kind a man does when he finally understands what he owes. "I tried to fine him for building the only reason we're alive," Preston said. "I can turn a crank." Elias studied him for 1 second, then nodded. "Back fence, left of the shed. The hatch is under the snow-lip red handle quarter turn, then work the primer until the gauge needle lifts." He handed Preston a headlamp. "Do not touch bare metal with bare skin." Preston nodded. Then he opened the back door. The cold came into the room like an animal. Preston stepped into it and vanished. Outside, the world was beyond weather. It was impact. Wind drove powdered snow into Preston's face so hard, he could not tell if his eyes were open. The cold found every seam in his clothing. It sliced between glove and sleeve. It sank through the soles of boots that had been designed for ski lodges, not survival. He pushed toward the shed by memory and the dim cone of his headlamp. Behind him, Owen had climbed through an upstairs window onto the low roof, belly crawling toward the buried solar panel with a snow rake tied to his wrist. Inside, Elias stood by the utility closet, counting time in his head. 5 minutes. 10:15. The bench still radiated heat, but the corners of the windows had begun to fog outside. Preston reached the compost pile and found nothing but a white mound. No hatch, no edge, no fence post he recognized. Just snow, wind, and the horrible realization that people die a few yards from safety all the time. He dropped to his knees and dug. The first layer was powder, the second was crust. The third had frozen into a slab. His shoulders burned, his lungs burned, his fingers began to throb, then ache, then fade. He thought of Laurel on the bench. He thought of Milo's small pink face returning from the cold. He thought of Elias opening the door without asking for an apology first. He dug harder. The shovel struck wood. Preston cleared the hatch and yanked it open. Steam breathed up from the wood chips beneath, ghostly in the headlamp. Inside the box, brass and rubber lines disappeared into the compost mound. A red handle protruded from the manifold, rimed with ice. He grabbed it with both gloved hands and pulled. Nothing. He braced his boot against the box and pulled again. Nothing. Panic made him angry, and anger made him careless. For one insane second, he almost stripped off a glove. Then Elias's warning snapped back. Do not touch bare metal with bare skin. Preston shoved the shovel handle through the loop of the red lever, used it as a bar, and threw his weight sideways. The ice cracked with a sound like a bone. The handle moved 1/4 turn. Inside the utility closet, Elias saw the pressure needle drop. Good, he whispered. But the pump still did not start. On the roof, Owen was losing feeling in his hands. He clawed at the iced panel with the rake, but the crust had bonded to the glass. He could see it under the snow, black, useless, inches away. Below, Naya pressed Milo to Laurel and stood. I have warm water, she said. Elias turned. What? The kettle. You can't go out. I don't need to. Owen's over the back porch roof, right? She filled a metal bottle with warm water from the kettle, wrapped it in a towel, and passed it through the upstairs window to Owen. Owen poured it in a thin stream along the upper edge of the panel. Not enough to melt the storm, enough to loosen one seam. He drove the rake under the crust and shoved. A sheet of ice slid off the panel and disappeared into the dark. A weak, gray dawn had begun behind the clouds. The solar controller blinked once. Then again, in the closet, the pump clicked. The hum returned. Not loud, not dramatic, beautiful. Preston heard it from the compost box through the lines under his hands, a trembling vibration moving through the hose. He laughed once, but the sound came out broken. Then he crawled to his feet and staggered toward the back door, following the rectangle of warm light, like a drowning man following shore. When he fell inside, Elias caught one arm and Laurel caught the other. His eyelashes were white. His face was gray. One glove was torn open. His fingers were waxy at the tips. They got him to the bench, not near it, on it. Laurel pulled off his outer layers while Naya wrapped his hands in dry cloth. Owen came down a minute later, shaking so violently he could not speak. Elias gave both men warm tea and said nothing until their breathing slowed. Preston looked at the clay beneath his legs, then at Elias. "You saved us," he said. Elias shook his head. "This morning, you saved the system." Preston's eyes filled before he could stop them. "No," he said. "You built the system before any of us believed there would be a morning like this." The cold held Briar Creek for 2 more days. The house became smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller, because 9 people had to share 1 room, 1 stove, and 1 rhythm. Larger because every person inside it slowly expanded into usefulness. Laurel rationed food with the precision Preston used to reserve for contracts. Owen repaired a cracked battery connector with foil, tape, and a stripped wire from an old lamp. Mr. Danver, who had barely spoken the first day, remembered how to bank a fire from his childhood and taught the others to read the color of a coal bed. Naya organized sleep shifts and watched everyone's hands for frostbite, because dispatch training had taught her that panic hides injuries. Preston became the doorman. He hated the cold now with personal respect. Every time someone had to open the door, Preston stood behind them with a blanket ready, counted seconds, and shut the cold out fast. By Sunday afternoon the wind finally dropped. The silence felt suspicious. Then, at 5:08 p.m. a streetlight outside Elias's front window flickered. Once, twice. Then, it stayed on. Across Quarry Lane, house alarms chirped back to life. Refrigerators clicked. Furnaces tried to restart. Somewhere under the snow, a generator coughed and died again. No one cheered. Not at first. They just sat there on the earthen bench, listening to the grid return like a guilty guest arriving late. Because the heat had been there before it, and the heat had not asked them who deserved it. The thaw came slowly over the next week. Road crews opened Quarry Lane, insurance adjusters arrived, plumbers became impossible to schedule. The neighborhood group chat filled with photographs of burst pipes, cracked drywall, ruined flooring, and one image that nobody joked about anymore. Elias Mercer's clay bench, glowing in firelight, with 9 pairs of boots drying under it. At the next Lakeview Association meeting, Preston Vale stood at the front of the room with 2 fingers, still bandaged from frostbite. He had a folder in his hand. Everyone expected a speech. He did not give one. He read a motion instead to repeal restrictions against rooftop solar panels, rain barrels, exterior wood storage, and inspected alternative heating systems, to create a neighborhood emergency supply fund, to map elderly residents and infants before the next outage, not after it, to stop treating resilience as an eyesore. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Naya raised her hand, then Owen, then the Danvers, then Laurel. The motion passed unanimously. Elias did not attend. He was at home, cleaning ash from the burn chamber. In May, when the last dirty snowbank had vanished from the north side of the street, another truck came to Quarry Lane. This one stopped in Preston Vale's driveway. It delivered clay, sand, fire brick, and straw. Half the neighborhood came outside to watch. Preston stood beside the pile in work boots, holding a notebook and looking less certain than he had ever looked in a boardroom. Elias walked up the driveway carrying a tape measure and a thermos of coffee. For a moment, the 2 men looked at the materials. Then Preston said, "So where do we start?" Elias looked at the house, then at the sky, then at the wires running along the street. "You start," he said, "by admitting the wire is not the warmth." By the end of summer, there were 3 heat banks on Quarry Lane. By the next winter, 5. They were not identical. Some were smaller, some used salvaged brick, some used better solar. All of them were inspected, argued over, adjusted, and tested before the first freeze. The neighborhood still had trimmed hedges. It still had phone apps. It still had people who cared too much about mailboxes, but something beneath it had changed. People stopped asking only what a house was worth. They started asking what it could keep alive. And on the coldest nights, when the wires hummed above the street and the wind moved through the maples, Quarry Lane no longer sounded like a place trusting one fragile delivery service. It sounded like a place that had learned to store warmth before it needed mercy, because Elias Mercer had not built an eyesore. He had built a bank, and when the whole street went bankrupt, he opened the vault.